Good morning. This is the Oneness Talking Point, episode 19, I think. Don't quote me on that because that might be wrong. Okay, episode 20. There you go, written on my fantastic desk planner calendar with all of the ways we have to remind ourselves of what's going on these days. We don't need to store it all in our recall. So, Padme is the topic of discussion this morning. And it's funny because it's come up in a few different places over the last month, I guess. And it's not something that I went out to research, and it's not something I chose because I have a bee in my bonnet about it, or there's something spectacular I want to say. I guess the first thing that makes sense is to tell you that it came to me, I guess is the answer to a question. And the question was, what do I call myself? In the world, of internets and meeting people and verbal communication, in that reality, there is a sense that we have a label that we give ourselves in order to explain ourselves, to form a boundary around who we are. Oftentimes, that's the career, or the thing we call our career. It's our gender, it's our family status, wife, husband, etc. And it's more than that. I guess for some people it's as simple as their name. And they just assume that everything else about them will be obvious. And if they are meeting someone that they think is a potential client, then they'll use the name of what it is that they think that they do, or the position that they feel that they hold. And that's kind of expanded beyond the boundaries of business and corporation. We've got, ever since love marks opposed to trademarks, we've got this reality of, I'm just trying to think of one. Nancy Drutton could come up with one in about 2 seconds. I am a lover of dogs that does XYZ for a particular client market so that they can achieve, blah, blah, blah. And that comes into the notion and explanation when we meet someone. And that meeting of people occurs virtually on the internet as much as it does at the supermarket. If you go to the supermarket, because you can order everything online now, or get someone to do all that stuff for you. And I guess for me, that sense of labels and the separation of work from everything else, and that concept of bounded identity, it's never kind of clarified itself for me how to navigate that in conversations. I still don't know how to answer the question, how are you? It's not an obvious thing for me. How am I? In what respect? How am I? What information are you fishing for when you ask that question? I don't know what the how means. And it's not that the I has aspects, and I'm saying, are you talking about my physical health or, my financial well-being? Because all of those things feel like one conversation for me. I'm not sure how you find the edges of one in order to build a wall to jump into a conversation about the next. For me, that there's not even a permeability because there are no lines. Like, I still can't see where the lines are. It's not that there's this Venn diagram of, circles that kind of overlap or sit beneath each other in different layers. I can't see how they're not just part of one field. Intellectually and experientially. I was going somewhere with that. So let's just come back to it if I remember. Okay, so what do I call myself? So that bounded identity stuff has never really made sense to me. Yes, I have a name. It was given to me and written on a piece of paper when my birth was registered. But that perception of physical versus non-physical, of me versus other, still doesn't translate for me. Even in an everyday experiential sense, not in some philosophical meditation awareness, just in the very awareness of sitting here, I still don't feel where the edges of me end. I don't feel where the voice and the message is a hand of spirit coming in through me. I can't feel a separateness. The words are sounds that appear, or the concept of sounds that appear to be emerging from, that are accepted as language. But how much of that perception itself is a notion which has been, I guess, created, but it's more than that. That is not the end of what it seems to be, I think, is the point. That concept of illusion versus truth doesn't really make sense to me either. It's not that there's more going on in another layer that can be revealed if you're really paying attention. And if you're not paying attention, it's just the surface. The concept of surface doesn't make sense. There is no deeper. There is no better, higher, more sacred perspective. It just feels like the morph of all that is playing out in a thing that appears to be dimensional and experiential. And so defining who I am, even as what I do, for a person who, and I use that word tentatively, who can't see the difference between being and doing, can't see the difference between all that is and what it appears to be. Because there's some concepts that there is a source, and that the source is kind of in this different state or field of non-being, and then it kind of has these layers which are kind of shielded from each other until they get to this so-called physicalness. That's not the story of oneness that makes sense to me. The story of oneness that makes sense to me is that it's just oneness. The appearance of trees and sunlight and the physics of that from the so-called human perspective of science can tell that story. And you don't need to make magical leaps. You know, it's unnecessary to divide the physics into metaphysics. You can just have the physics that's accepted as physics. And at some point we'll have explanations, you know, because it's really just about seeing where those lines match up. It's not about contorting the information that we think we have into something that proves what we feel is true. At least not in the oneness perspective that makes sense to me, in the physics of oneness. I don't need to push anything into an unnatural field, whatever that means, in order to make it prove what makes sense to me. And so when I ask the question, what word or name or title or label should I use? Because there are many in different situations. You know, some conversations I have, it feels natural to say, I'm a oneness oracle, or an oracle of oneness. However, that feels more comfortable in the moment. And sometimes it's Diva Avatar, which is a label that was given to me by these two fabulous mystics, which I had no idea what it meant at the time, and I'm still redefining it for myself in the rearrangement of remastering the language that we have available, which feels like one of my jobs. You know, there's this sense that all of the languages are separate and can be translated into one another, and I just have this very different perspective of how they fit together, you know, of how they are significant to one another. And it's not in that sense that they sit beside one another, or that, you know, viewing the world through a particular lens, you can see the relational objects. It's unnecessary to translate or to sit beside. There's another way. I mean, I guess quantum is the closest thing we have to really understanding the notion of coexisting. I was going to bring Schrodinger's cat in there, but I'm not going to, because even that's a very spear concept of reality and consciousness and what is physical and what is not. And I think the explanation that makes sense to me acknowledges that that's one presupposition. It doesn't take that core perspective that requires, you know, that path to be a path. I think the core perspective that allows that to be true needs to be, you know, visible, acknowledged and analysed in itself. You know, the assumptions that allow that to be a perspective at all. And so the word I was given to describe myself was Padme. And I've heard it. It's not that it was a completely new word that was kind of plucked out of the universe that I thought, oh, did this word even exist? But I really had no concept of what it meant. And I guess I still don't. you can Google it, and it says Padme means lotus. And what lotus means to those who use the word Padme now, in all of the places that it's used, it's not necessarily what it means to those who used the word Padme, 1,000 years ago, in all the places that it was used. I don't accept universality of those terms. I understand that the notions change, which is why I'm happy not to be fixed, which is why in some places I do use the word oracle, and in other places I do use the word diva avatar, and in some places I use the word counselor, as in to counsel or to be counsel, which is a very reflective and hopefully refractive process. And there's something about the notion of conversation and communication that comes up when we start talking about that. The notion of what it is that I call myself. Because the assumption is that it's about what I do for, what I do to, what I do in. And I think the doing and beingness are the same thing for me. So there's no doing to or doing for or doing in. There's only simply being. And if it's called counsel, then that counsel is not a notion of exchange. It's not a listening to and analysing of something separate from me. It's the same paying attention that occurs when I use the term diva avatar, or the same simply being that occurs with the concept of Padme, counsel, oracle. They're not notions of exchange. They're not notions of separation. They're not actions, except of oneness, simply being. Even if the experience appears, feels, seems to be listening, advising, I guess even loving is another important way. If it's the notion of loving, even that for me is not an action. It's not a thing that you do to or for either yourself or someone else. Not in the cosmology of oneness, where that sense of identity can't be separated from all that is. So whatever's occurring or seems to be occurring just seems to be occurring. You seem to be a bounded identity with skin and ideas and memories that can divide their mind from heart and soul. But in my understanding and experience of what is, the concepts of mind and heart and soul are unnecessary. I don't have a place for soul in the notion of oneness that makes sense to me. It just feels like another field of separation that wants to say there's a journey between this as a real thing to the source or the divine, which is a real thing, and they can be known in and of themselves separately. I can't fathom it. I mean, I can fathom it when I'm in counsel, when it's somebody's truth. Then the whole universe makes sense to me like that for them. I can see that's true. It's not a dismissive replacement of what's true for anyone else. But in the oneness experience, that makes sense to me. It's unnecessary. I guess the same way that in looking for or asking about the terms that I need to be using in reference to my identity, how do I introduce myself on a business card or on a website or to a person in the line at the shopping centre? It's also that sense that we're encouraged to talk about our gifts and our expertise. And neither does that make sense to me. I mean, the concept of expert and guru. Okay, you could say I am the expert of the surrender of not knowing. But that would only be true for as long as it was true, and then it wouldn't be. The truth of not knowing, the foundation of surrender is not knowing. It's of being available to the truth as it reveals itself. It's not that the mist is over there and the real is over here and I'm summoning something from the mist. There's just the mist. And the mist appears to be the physicality, and the mist appears to be the identity, the gender and the name and the question and the answer. But I still understand the world as the mist. And when I say the world, I don't mean the thing outside of myself. There's nothing outside. There's just the mist. So the world includes all of the things that you would normally name as self and internal, which for me there's no self and internal versus other and external. It's just the mist. And I really can't experience the world as a thing that's permeable, because that's a border. There's a border between the permeable parts. Does that make sense? In order for something to be permeable, there has to be a separateness. There has to be two cells or two aspects. There can be the appearance of those things and the seemingness and in an experience of it. But that doesn't necessarily make it so. And even in the appearance of it, we can trust, if that's our truth, that there is no separation. So I guess it's really what makes sense to you? Are you the mist? Because you're not even in the mist. I think that's the thing. Like, there are so many stories about spirituality, as if spirituality is a separate thing that exists in the world. My experience, my oneness experience, is the mist. It's not being in the mist. It's not traveling to the mist or tapping into the mist or drawing from the mist. It's not being tuned to the mist. It's just the mist. And the experience of that includes all of these things that we call relationships and careers, feelings and thoughts, desires, things we like to call mistakes, impulses, questions and answers. And having a language to understand how that's possible, how all of those things can be the mist, is my brief, I guess, is the thing that I'm being asked to focus on. I don't know how else to say that. It's not that I'm being asked by anything. It's that the mist is making it so. So how does the world make sense to you? Is it all one thing and there's no self of inside and outside? Or do you have some other experience? Is there a physical and non-physical for you? Are there kind of layers and shields towards the source where the non-form slowly comes to a place where form is possible? You know, is consciousness a thing for you? A thing that can be known and separated from other things? You know, is the notion of God a creative force? You know, are you a subject, an object of something else? Is your experience an illusion? And is there a realness beyond that illusion that you can access through practice or prayer or magic or some other means? Because ultimately it doesn't matter what makes sense to me, except to me. What matters in the conversation that you're having is what makes sense to you. You know, and if it helps to argue the points that I've made in order to make your truth visible, then do that. If it helps to ponder the truth that makes sense to you in comparison to what makes sense to me. And I think, you know, for a lot of people that I talk to, there's a sense of shame and desire that comes because they've put up on a pedestal that they would love to have the oneness experience the way it makes sense to me. And you can have that shame and desire if that makes sense to you. And I would never want to talk you out of what makes sense to you. You know, and there are several directions that we would go in if we were actually having a conversation, if you were telling me. And one of them would be, so how is that perfect? Because I think what happens is we get so used to the pathology of things. And you can access that anywhere. So if you took away this notion of comparison or shame and desire about what it is that you wanted to be that you weren't at the moment, you could take that to just about any, therapist or spiritual advisor, and they can pathologize it. They can say, right, well, it's probably because you're out of alignment, or there are cognitive behavioral misalignments, there's an incoherence there somewhere between what you say, what you think and believe and what you're doing, or you're disembodied, or, there would be some action that you could take to kind of settle down that sense of shame and desire, so that it wouldn't need to be there to highlight what it was that you're not doing. And I'm not discouraging you from doing that. And it's possible for us to have that conversation. But the conversation that makes more sense to me is that you're already perfect. That's the rubbish people picking up our rubbish. Thank you. It's so lucky people come pick up our rubbish. The thing that would make sense to me is to bring you back to your perfection. And in bringing you back to your perfection, there's all these objections that come up for you, for the people that call themselves my clients. And so we acknowledge and accept those objections. It's like the more I love you just as you are, the more doubts, the things that we call doubts and notions of imperfection feel safe to be part of the conversation. And when they feel safe to be part of the conversation, instead of slamming them down and saying, right, well, that's because you're not good enough, or you're not where you should be yet, or you're not realizing your potential, or whatever. When they feel safe to be part of the conversation, and we say, right, okay, so what if those things were powerful and equally sacred parts of your purpose? Then how would we make sense of them? What if it wasn't a problem? The same truth, we're not flipping it on its head and we're not finding a silver lining. The same revelation that felt safe to be part of the conversation, what if it wasn't a problem? What if it was part of your perfection? What story would we tell in order for that to make sense? And that's the story that's very rarely told. And it's not that there's anything wrong with the pathology story. It's just that's not the story I'm being asked to look for. It's not the story that I see. When all of those truths make themselves visible, it makes perfect sense to me that you are still, valuable and whole and sacred and perfect for your purpose, including all of those things. It never occurs to me to get rid of anything, to upgrade anything. And just by acknowledging them as sacred, something magical happens. And I'm not promising it as an outcome. I'm sure if you really sat with it, you would know what I'm saying. You would have had an experience of how acceptance, and the ability to see something as sacred has been magical for you. And if you haven't, what then? What comes in for you in that deflated sense of I'm not special and I haven't seen the sacredness and felt the perfection of being accepted when I reveal the things I call imperfections and mistakes and not there yet aspects of myself. I guess like the ego, there's this sense of dividing. If you have an identity, it's often divided into selves: child self, higher self, ego, id, super ego, if you're a Jungian. And there's a sense that primal desires and other aspects of self, they may not be evil, but there's an opposition there. They're not valued equally for their sacredness. They're valued because you need to keep them in check, and they show you where you shouldn't go or what you shouldn't indulge. They show you when you're off track. They're the dark side, the aspect of self that shows you who you don't want to be. And I guess what makes sense to me is without the lines drawn between to divide into little pockets who we are, the wholeness of that without labels is perfect for our purpose. If we can see how it makes sense. And in seeing how it makes sense, something magical happens. We see how it makes sense. Seeing the wholeness of the perfection of our purpose, I guess, is there something magical that happens. That can't be separated from an action and a reaction. Or a course of action and an outcome or a result or a change, But you need to know for yourself if that's true. And even if it's in complete opposition and replacement of the ideas that I espouse, that's where I want you to be. In the truth that makes sense to you, in the story where you feel like the boss, where you feel understood, where you feel solid. I prefer the mist. It makes sense to me. If you need to feel solid and have facts and a definite point of source and contact and identity, then that's what you need. There's no judgment of that. There's no need for me to counsel and advise you and shift you off your point of certainty. I think your point of certainty is perfect. I think your question of the point of certainty is perfect. I think your return to the point of certainty is perfect. I don't see pathology. That's not my job. So what does that mean for you? Because I love you just the way you are. And what's the label that makes sense to you? Is it the same all the time, or do you have different notions? Are you given different instructions? Does it make sense to you not to have any label? Okay, I'm gonna sign off now. Episode 20, The Oneness Experience. And I'll talk to you on the first Monday of next month, according to Brisbane time in Australia, which I'll post somewhere for you to find so you can watch it. Okay, much love.